Jesus Christ.
Oh, I got it. All right, guys, so yesterday we only got to this slide, which is awesome.
We made
That's
so
how
much
you know we're
progress.
productive.
Yeah. So let's go through this real quick. Why did European countries begin investing in exploration? First, monarchs needed money in order to fund the new mercenary armies that were dominating the battlefields of Europe. Pikemen and cannons and muskets are expensive, and to pay for it, you need taxes. Many European monarchs did not have the ability to tax their population very heavily, so they were looking for new sources of revenue, and one easily controlled source of revenue was international trade. So they began investing in establishing new trade routes. Portugal is going to invest in exploring and then trading in Western Africa, and as that becomes very successful, they are then going to continue and push all the way to India and develop a trade route to India. Spain is going to attempt to copy this, but end up, instead of finding a trade route to the old world, find an entirely new region of the world to exploit. So the commerce thing, the need for taxes, is directly linked to the politics thing, which is competition between monarchies. The monarchies are fighting for control. They need cash in order to pay for these new expensive armies, and that's why they're so interested in developing new trade routes. The religious thing helps to explain both the motivation for exploration, but then also the justification for it. So one reason that Portugal and Spain want to explore beyond just making money is they also want to spread Catholicism. This is especially important to them once the Protestant Reformation starts, because they are losing ground in Northern Europe, but they hope to make up for it by spreading Catholicism to all of the places they trade. For example, in the Congo, the king of Congo, Afonso I, converts to Catholicism immediately. Yes, Mary?
Would another cause of exploration be just like advancements in technology in general, since there's more technology towards sea-based trade?
Absolutely. That's my last one.
Oh, I didn't even see that. I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Well, good job. Yeah. So, also, none of this would be possible if the technology wasn't at a certain level. But because of a variety of advances, some which were native to Europe, for example, various types of hull design, like the Caravel's actual deep hull was an original European development. But then most of the other technologies that made this possible, like the lateen sail, like the magnetic compass, like the astrolabe, were developed in other parts of the world. For example, the compass in China or the astrolabe in the Middle East. Was there another question, Evan?
About the Catholicism thing. So it's kind of a given that like Spain would try to convert everyone, but I wanted to know how much like Portugal emphasized that. So they did it, but I don't know to what extent.
Portugal and Spain are very similarly religious. They're both very devoutly committed to the Pope and to Catholicism. And for a large part of this period, beginning around the early 1600s, Spain and Portugal are actually going to unify under Philip II, who is a super devout Catholic and basically wants to establish a global Catholic empire. Cool. And then the last point is religion is not only a motivation, but it's also a justification. So when you roll up and start doing things that seem bad, for example, destroying whole civilizations and then leveling their cities and then building different cities on top of those cities, like the Spanish did in Tenochtitlan, aka Mexico City, that might seem bad, but you can use the idea of Catholicism to justify it, because you're destroying a non-Christian culture and converting people to Christianity. So those are thousands or millions of people who would have gone to hell, who have now been saved by your efforts. Same thing for the slave trade. Like, it might seem bad to chain 350 people up in the hold of a ship and then send them across the ocean where about a third of them will die before they even get there. But fortunately, you'll have a priest on board, and those guys will be converted to Christianity forcibly on the boat. So when they do die and then get thrown overboard to be fed to sharks, they'll go to heaven. So you're not even doing anything bad. So in that way, religion can function not only as a motivation, but also as a justification for the brutal acts that are necessary to build these commercial systems. Cool. Next slide, please, Kamara. So I'm intentionally not putting a lot of words on the slide to keep you guys from doing the thing where you just write down every word on the slide. So instead, you guys should just listen to these concepts. So first of all, the two big empires that emerged during this time period, the two first big commercial empires, are the Portuguese and the Spanish empires. And they're very different types of empires. You guys might remember this from AP World when you took it. But the Portuguese Empire is based on a model of coercive trade, or sometimes known as armed trade, where you work out deals with local rulers, and then you enforce those deals with cannons. This is different from what Spain does, where Spain literally takes over whole civilizations and converts them into tools for their imperial dominance. And so the reason for these differences simply has to do with the types of society that Portugal runs into versus the types of society that Spain runs into. So Portugal is interacting with powerful, technologically advanced states in West Africa and then in India. These are places with advanced metallurgy, like iron and bronze. These are places with diseases all their own. For example, West Africa has wildly contagious malaria and yellow fever that just drops white people like flies. So invading and taking over West Africa or India is basically not an option for the Portuguese. So what they do is they establish trading posts, they build little forts, and then they work out deals with local rulers. So in many ways, the Portuguese Empire is really just a series of trading posts, all along the coast of Africa and then around the Indian Ocean. They do have an advantage in military technology thanks to advanced firearms and cannons, but they cannot turn these advanced technologies into an actual territorial empire. Rather, they just use it to work out advantageous trading terms with local rulers. With Spain, on the other hand, it's totally the opposite. Spain is encountering civilizations that are still in the Stone Age. The Aztecs, in spite of their advanced language, poetry, philosophy, astronomy, are still fighting with obsidian-bladed weapons. So when the Spanish show up with bronze cannons and steel armor, armored horses, cannons, they're in a position not just to enforce favorable trade terms, but rather to seize control of the entire empire, which is what they do. They do not destroy the Aztec civilization. They simply remove the head and put themselves on top. They take out the capital city of Tenochtitlan, they kill the emperor Moctezuma, and they put themselves in charge, and more or less just keep everything else in place at first. They keep the same taxation system, they keep the same road networks, but instead of all those taxes going to the Aztec Empire, those taxes and that tribute is now going to Spain. And of course, one of the other key differences is that whereas in India and Africa, the diseases were working against white people, in America, the diseases are working distinctly in the favor of the white people. Smallpox, influenza, measles, chickenpox, mumps, rubella, whooping cough. All of these are diseases brought over by Europeans that Native Americans have zero tolerance for. And it results in up to a 90% loss of population over the course of the first 100 years after exposure. So whereas the Black Death rocked Europe by destroying between 1/3 and 50% of the population, this whole wave of European epidemics basically annihilates the population of the Americas, which then leaves a more or less unopposed continent for the Europeans to move in and take over. Of course, there are still pockets of resistance, and there are still millions of indigenous people who survive these waves of epidemics, but their societies are gravely weakened because of this. This is also one of the key reasons that Spain then has to rely on slave labor in order to make their empire profitable, because there's not a lot of people left over, and that means that the price of labor is incredibly high. You remember how after the Black Death, peasants were able to demand a higher wage for their labor? Or after COVID, Burger King had to pay people $15 an hour to go to work?
Wait, they actually started paying people?
Who?
Like these companies actually started paying people?
Yeah.
Oh,
Have you seen signs for like signing bonuses to work at like Wendy's?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. That's actually a really interesting parallel between the Black Death and COVID, is these pandemics have allowed workers to demand higher wages.
I thought they just started like asking for like younger ages.
Well, of course businesses are looking for ways to get around just paying people more. But I think it has resulted in higher wages in a lot of service industries. But so anyway, it doesn't work when people are just all dead. So Spain and the other American colonial powers began turning instead to slavery to fill the shortage of workers. Wonder if Burger King thought about that. Sneha?
Wait, sorry, just to clarify, so they had to use slave labor because all of their other, wait, was it conquistadors too? Or those the people that were,
Yeah, so the Spanish conquistadors?
yeah, did they all die from, malaria and stuff?
No, it's just that the conquistadors are a small number of warrior nobles. And these guys are not the people who are going to mine silver or grow sugarcane.
Oh.
These are the guys who come in and claim whole valleys for themselves, and then they tell the people who live there that they now have to pay taxes to them. And the people who live there are like 10% of the previous people who live there, living in little scattered villages all over the place. And so to actually get work done, they have to rely on systems of forced labor. And this involves not just the African slave trade, but also systems of forced labor in which indigenous people are required to pay taxes in the form of free labor. So like once a month, or one month a year, you have to show up and work on your landlord's mine, or whatever. Build roads. Yes, Mary?
Did they also kind of rely on Africans specifically because a lot of indigenous people just knew the land and could just run away? However, African slaves were on a completely different continent that they didn't know where to go.
Yeah, so there's tons of reasons why African slaves were a more effective form of agricultural labor. And one is that indigenous people could just run away and merge back in with existing indigenous communities. Another is that indigenous people tended to die if they hung out with white people for too long, because even the remaining indigenous people still had a way lower tolerance for these diseases that the Europeans had brought in. Whereas Africa had been exposed to the same types of diseases, so they were not only immune to all of those European diseases, but they were also immune to malaria because of certain genetic differences that existed in West Africa. So not only were they resistant to European diseases, but they were actually also resistant to a disease that was killing a lot of white people in the tropics. On top of that, they also had experience with tropical agriculture, growing a lot of these crops. A lot of the food crops grown in and around slave plantations were African crops, like peas or like yams or stuff like that. So, however, there were large communities of escaped African slaves and criminal white people who ran into the backcountry, and you see the rise of mixed communities of indigenous, white, and African communities, sometimes known as maroon communities, sometimes known as quilombos in Brazil. And these are super cool, but not really connected to the class very much. But there's millions of people who run away from slavery and just live in the woods and wait for it all to blow over. It only takes 400 years. All right, so Portugal trades with guns, Spain takes over, and then forces people to work for them. Next one. So Spain and Portugal decide that the best way to avoid a war is just to divide the world in half. So they ask the Pope to help them work out a deal. And the Pope and Spain and Portugal get together at a town called Tordesillas. And they simply divide the entire world in half with a line that goes right here, which means that kind of weirdly, Portugal ends up with Brazil. Spain ends up with the whole rest of the Americas. And literally what this is doing is this is giving Portugal and Spain a legal claim to conquer and rule every non-Christian territory in the world. So everything that's not already Christian, which would be Europe and then Ethiopia, Portugal just gets all of this, and Spain gets all of that. Of course, you have to draw another line, otherwise they just blend into each other. And so another line is drawn like right here, which gives Spain the Philippines, named after King Philip. Yes?
When is Australia discovered?
No, weirdly, Australia was not really a big deal until like in the 1700s when the Dutch began exploring it, and then the British end up claiming it and using it as just a place to dump criminals. But I don't know why it took so long for Australia to be discovered and to become a site for colonial settlement, except that most of the economic action is up here, and there's not a lot of stuff going on down here. Yes, Anand?
Actually, no.
Okay, cool. Yes, Lynn?
Who decided to draw the lines? Because it doesn't seem very fair.
Well, the Pope and Spain and Portugal decided on that.
Spain's rulers probably not very smart.
Yeah.
Well,
Actually, it might be because there was a lot of silver in the Americas, right?
No, I would.
Yeah.
Depending on the
Wouldn't you rather want like the Spain line because you can't really conquer anything on
Yeah.
this line?
yeah, so I don't know which one I'd rather have. Like, obviously, both empires are incredibly popular or profitable, but would you rather have two continents that you can just straight up conquer, or would you rather have other wealthy, powerful civilizations that you can trade with? They're both amazing. And the line was drawn based more on what they had already claimed. So this was drawn after Spain had gone ahead and claimed Mexico and South America, and after Portugal had already developed its trade route around Africa. So this was largely just recognizing something that had already happened. One other thing that's worth keeping in mind is that everybody ignores this except for Spain and Portugal. So Britain, France, the Netherlands, Denmark, they all start sailing around and claiming stuff anyway. And then Portugal and Spain are like, hey, no, we have a piece of paper that says you're not allowed to do that. And of course, that doesn't accomplish anything. Yes, Dash?
So did Spain ever come in contact with Indonesia or Malaysia?
Yes. So Spain, one of Spain's most important colonies was the Philippines. And then they used the Philippines as a base for trading with Indonesia and Malaysia and China to get access to spices and silk. So in the long run, Spain actually does get a trade route to China. It just takes them a while because they have to settle the Americas first. But there's a trade route that goes from Spain to Mexico, and then they unload all their stuff in Mexico and they ship it across Mexico to Acapulco, and they load everything back up, and then they ship it to China. And it's actually problematic because there's so much good stuff in China that a lot of the silver mined in South America ends up going to China illegally rather than going back to Spain, because corrupt officials are willing to ship that silver out in exchange for silk and spices and stuff like that, rather than just paying it all back to Spain like they're supposed to. Yes, Mary?
Were there any sort of like luxury goods in the Americas?
Oh yeah, there was lots of luxury goods in Americas. There were
Besides
pearls.
Besides
Yeah, so besides silver, which there was just a vast quantity of silver in the Americas, mostly in Bolivia, but also in central Mexico. Both places were called Potosi. The one in Mexico was named after the one in South America. But there were all sorts of other luxury items as well. There were fancy woods, incenses, chocolate, pearls, all sorts of cool stuff. Yeah. And in North America, furry little critters that you can turn into hats. Mostly beaver. Next slide, please.
Found a dead beaver on the side of the road near here.
I saw a dead beaver in the road on the way to school a couple years ago. Like
Yeah.
right. Yeah, wasn't that so
It was a few
sad?
years
It was
ago.
like on the overpass over 540 or
Shut up.
147. And I was
Yeah.
like, oh, bud, no, like
Yeah, it was
you're so far
near-
from home.
It was near 147.
Uh-huh. That made me really sad.
It was my freshman year.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
What?
Cool. It was March, because I remember I was doing March Mammal Madness, and I just studied the beaver as a contender in March Mammal Madness. And I ended up picking the beaver to go pretty far, because I read that beavers had actually killed several people. One guy got bit in the leg by a beaver, and the beaver tooth pierced his femoral artery,
Ooh.
and he bled out before he could get to a hospital. So don't mess with beavers.
Way to go, beaver.
Okay, so let's talk about the Columbian Exchange. Now, I know you guys know most of this stuff, because we talk about it like crazy in AP World. But let's go over it real quick. So, what are some of the most important things that Eurasia gives America? In the Columbian Exchange, this is not a trade route, this is biological species being spent back and forth. So, what are some biological things given to the Americas from Eurasia? Yes?
Horses?
Horses are a huge deal. Yeah.
Cows?
Cows. Large livestock. The largest livestock that they had in the Americas was llamas, which were not super useful. So this totally transforms a lot of Native American societies, because as soon as they get horses, they basically figure out how to be Mongols. They become nomadic pony herders. Dope. What else? Come here.
Wheat, rice, grain, barley.
Yeah, so a lot of the key staple crops of the European diet. Wheat, barley, grapes,
Coffee.
olive oil, coffee, yeah. Also, more important than any of this, though, for shaping the Americas, is not something you actually want.
Disease.
The diseases. So the diseases are probably the most important thing sent over by the Columbian Exchange. And they more or less clear the way for Europeans to occupy and settle that territory. Okay, now, from America to Eurasia, you do get one fun disease that we've been talking about a lot.
Syphyillis.
Syphilis. America gives Europe syphilis. But other than that, it's mostly good stuff. So I think some of the plants that the Americas have are maybe some of the best plants you could possibly have if you're trying to build a civilization. Namely potatoes and corn. Potatoes and corn both become major staple food crops in Europe. And it's come to the point where the historian Charles C. Mann has said you cannot understand the Industrial Revolution without understanding the history of the potato in Northern Europe. Because the potato is such a productive food crop that it allows more and more people to sustain themselves in these relatively small areas, which then helps to sustain these growing urban centers. Yes, Ethan?
Was tobacco
Yeah, Camara said tobacco also.
Oh, she did.
Yeah, but tobacco was really important. It became a major trading commodity. It's what kept Virginia afloat when they were first starting out. Also, it's a stimulant, and I think stimulants are underrated as a historical force. Think about how much less math would get done if it wasn't for coffee, cigarettes, and ADHD medicines, which are also stimulants. Ritalin is just like a watered down form of speed. Yes, Liam?
Some potatoes also like grow really well in the cold.
Yes, potatoes are cold tolerant. That's why the Incas used them even in the super highlands. And they grow, they're relatively easy to grow in poor soil, and they grow a lot of calories in a small area. Like a single acre of potatoes, if done right, can produce thousands of pounds of potatoes, which is amazing. So, what's up?
What about people?
People?
Yeah, from Eurasia to America. Technically, people was on the Columbian Exchange.
Oh,
As
yeah.
slaves.
Oh, yeah, that's true. So, I mean,
To an extent.
to be fair, I mean, the species Homo sapien was already present in the Americas, but there was an increase of the genetic diversity as people from different continents began mixing in the Americas. Okay, cool. So what are the long-term impacts for America and for Europe? Go ahead and scroll down.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, wait. Yeah, that's cool, actually. So the long-term impact for the Americas is a rapid decline in population, followed by a gradual increase in population as settlers from Europe and enslaved people from Africa come in and occupy the territory that is made available.
Wait, could you repeat that?
So the long-term consequence for America is a rapid decline of population at first. Here. So this is a graph of population from 1400 to 1800. In the Americas, it looks like this. And in Europe, it looks like this. And potatoes get caught on as a major crop sometime around here. Potatoes. You cannot understand the history of the Industrial Revolution without understanding the history of potatoes in Northern Europe.
Industrial Revolution.
The potato revolution. All right, cool. So, nice. Some of you guys might recognize this slide from 9th grade World Civ.
Oh.
Oh, I
Oh
remember
my
this.
god.
Yep, this is my amazing Microsoft Paint skills. So, so this is the silver trade. The silver trade results in an incredible boom of European economic growth. So here's what happens. Is Spain mines an insane amount of silver in Mexico and South America. Like literally a mind-boggling, uncountable amount of silver. It's estimated today that 1/3 of all silver in the world was mined from a single site, Potosi, high in the Bolivian Andes. And that if you are wearing any sterling silver stuff right now, you are probably wearing at least a little tiny bit of that mountain, which is cool. So that silver largely goes to Spain. However, a big chunk of it also ends up going just straight to China. China needs silver. The Chinese dynasty, the Ming dynasty, has just declared silver its only acceptable form of currency for the payment of taxes. So now every single person in China needs silver in order to not go to debtor's prison or, some other form of punishment. So what that means is that silver is now in super high demand in Asia. The silver can then be sent on ships around Africa to India or to China, where it can be traded very profitably for spices, silk, porcelain, cottons, stuff like that. This stuff is then transported back to Spain, where it is taxed heavily by the Spanish monarchy. So at every point, the Spanish monarchy is making huge amounts of money. When the silver comes in, they take their cut. The silver goes out, and when the stuff comes back, the Spanish monarchy taxes that as well. So this is giving the Spanish crown incredible amounts of wealth. Yes, Amit?
Did China make this change in currency for tax based off the Spanish mining a lot of silver?
No, they actually made this change independently. It's a really strange and fateful historical coincidence that right as Spain is discovering the most insane possible amount of silver ever, that China has decided to make silver its official currency. Which means that there is now a market for all of this silver. If China hadn't done that, the global value of silver would have probably plummeted as Spain just leaked silver out all over the rest of the world. Inflation. Yes?
So say that the entire Spanish silver thing never happened, the coast never gets discovered. Do you think China still have continued to use silver as their only form of taxes, or would it have been did they have enough domestic supply to do that?
They had actually almost no domestic supply of silver, which is why switching to silver seems like kind of an odd policy choice. Before they were reliant on Spain for silver, they actually were reliant on Japan for silver production. But Japan actually shuts down most foreign trade around the same time with the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate. So it's all of these weird coincidences happening at the same time that basically opens up the world market to Spanish silver.
What dynasty was it again?
The Ming dynasty.
Thank you.
And the Ming dynasty was partially reacting to the failure of paper currency that had been used by previous Chinese dynasties. And so they were switching back to a currency based on silver.
Did they just come into power?
So this is all around the year 1600. 1600 is when the Spanish silver mines really start producing. 1600 is when Japan closes off foreign trade with the Tokugawa shogunate, and 1600 is around when the Ming dynasty adopts this policy. Cool. Okay, now one last thing. Here, scroll back up a little bit. Is all the other European governments are seeing what's going on with Spain, and they're going to do everything in their power to get in on the action. And this is going to lead to the rise of piracy, in which France and England are both going to legalize piracy in the Caribbean, leading to the rise of the Pirates of the Caribbean. Yep.
Yeah. Jack Black.
And yeah, Captain Jack Black Sparrow. Okay, so yeah, and also it's going to lead to these other countries expending huge amounts of money trying to establish their own colonies and hopefully find similar amounts of silver in other parts of the world. Okay, thanks, Kamara. Let's go.
Was land-based trade basically done with, or was this some more than sustenance?
Okay, so that was one of the major trading systems in the world. That's the silver trade. The other major trading system is sometimes known as the Atlantic system. It's occasionally called the triangular trade, but more recent historiography has showed that very few ships actually engaged in triangular trade. What you had was just constant trade between the Americas, Europe, and Africa. So you got three different trading spheres. So in the Americas, you've got raw materials. In Europe, you've got manufactured goods. And in Africa, you've got people. So the key here is that there's an imbalance in what each one has and what each one needs. So Africa and America need manufactured goods. So Europe becomes the center of manufacturing. This largely lays a lot of the economic groundwork for the later Industrial Revolution, as Europe is already a hub for manufacturing. It's just, at this point, it's millions of craftsmen in cities churning out furniture and guns and swords and tools and clocks and cloth and boots and barrels and everything that you could possibly need. And Europe is exporting all of that. In Africa, African states are willing to trade people and gold and cloth and ivory, but mostly people for European manufactured goods. And this is cloth, but it's also iron and bronze and European firearms. All of these are highly sought after commodities in Africa. Africa then exports people to Latin America and the Caribbean. And then these people are used to produce raw materials like sugar and coffee and cotton and stuff like that to export back to Europe, so that allows for manufacturing to occur. All of this results in lots of money for European traders and European governments. One thing that's important to keep in mind is that sugar is the key commodity. Sugar, which is produced on the coast of Brazil and the Caribbean, is by far the largest market. It's around the year 1600 that a lot of our current favorite desserts become a thing. If you like Wikipedia the history of a lot of desserts, you'll probably see that they came into existence around the year 1600. For example, the word frosting is first found in the early 1600s. And that's largely because it's slave labor in the Caribbean and Brazil that made sugar a widely available and highly taxed commodity in Europe. So you've simultaneously got the silver trade and the sugar trade going on. One is the Atlantic system and the other is the global silver trade. Yes, Ahmed?
Was sugar brought to the Americas?
Yes, sugar started out as a crop grown in the Indus River Valley. It then spread to the Middle East. From there, it was taken by the Europeans and grown in the Mediterranean and on various islands. And from there, it was taken to the Caribbean islands and then to Brazil. And yeah. Cool. So it's not one single ship doing all of this, but it's just a bunch of ships going back and forth in all directions, moving European raw materials to the other parts, moving people to the Americas, and then moving raw materials back to Europe. Cool. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about the overall economic effects on different parts of Europe. So obviously for Portugal and Spain, it is good. Good. Money for king. Yay. Cool. However, there are some funny effects on Spain. One thing that happens with Spain is they begin importing so much silver that they end up causing inflation. Also, Spain is going to spend most of their money on religious wars. So rather than investing this incredible windfall on better infrastructure or a more centralized and efficient state, Spain is going to spend all of its money equipping huge armies of very well-trained Spaniards to go try and kill Protestants in the Netherlands and Germany and Italy, and also fight the Ottomans. So you're having people leaving Spain and huge amounts of silver coming into Spain. So the Spanish economy is actually staying about the same, but all of this silver is circulating, which results in inflation. Now, for Italy, all of this is bad news. Why is this bad news for Italy?
Because they were the ones that were super advanced.
Well, so Italy was super advanced. Italy is no longer going to be the engine of European cultural development or economic growth that it used to be. Why not?
It relied a lot of trade because it was like it had a ton of port cities. So,
Yeah.
But now, since the Portuguese were conquering like areas in Africa and the Spanish were in the Americas, they used port cities there, and they were able to access those areas instead of going through the Italian area.
Right.
Also, the Mediterranean was the biggest facilitator for that trade that the Italians used, and since you can go out into the Atlantic and go to the Americas to do that trade, and trade specifically in the Atlantic basin, the Mediterranean is kind of a bit more useless.
Correct. Yeah. The Mediterranean ceases to be a major trade route in the world. The Atlantic is now the center of the action, and that means that you're going to see the rise of Atlantic coastal cities like Amsterdam, London, and Paris, and the decline of Mediterranean cities like Istanbul and Venice. Anand?
The Ottomans are the Ottomans still trading with Venice though?
Yes, the Ottomans are still trading with Venice, but you're also going to see this is going to kind of mark the beginning of the decline of Ottoman power. And so both Venice and the Ottomans are Mediterranean powers, and power is going to shift north to the Atlantic port cities. This is amazing for the Netherlands for a couple of reasons. One is that the Netherlands is owned by Spain at this point, and the Netherlands becomes the manufacturing hub for the Spanish Empire. This is a huge mistake by Spain. So rather than investing in their own manufacturing and building up their own cities, they just let the Dutch do it for them. So you see the rise of Amsterdam and Bruges and Antwerp and Rotterdam, these Dutch and Belgian cities. These guys emerge as the major economic centers of the Spanish Empire. And then Protestantism becomes popular in the Netherlands, and these cities break away from Spain. So basically the biggest and richest part of the Spanish European Empire is going to become independent and take most of Spain's profit with them. So this turns out to be amazing for the Netherlands, not just because they're an Atlantic port city, but because they also get to take a lot of the Spanish silver and invest it in themselves. For Europe as a whole, this is obviously incredibly beneficial. This is, in many ways, the beginning of the European explosion, both in economic productivity and also just in sheer numbers. The European population is going to grow way faster than the rest of the world, partially because of potatoes, but partially also because of increasing industrialization and economic opportunity. So this is going to be great for Europe. The effects for the world as a whole, I don't even know where to begin talking about that, so I'm not even going to start. But it's a lot.
Was this progress?
Was it progress?
Ooh.
Whoa.
Progress isn't a thing.
Cultural relativism.
Do we have another segment into philosophy?
No.
You have 5 minutes left.
We have 5 minutes. So we now have 5 minutes to talk about the intellectual impact of the voyages of exploration. My plan is to talk about this more on Friday. Let me just tell you a little bit about Michel de Montaigne, because he's my favorite of these guys. I like all of them, but Michel de Montaigne is my favorite. Partially because he wrote a lot about his cat, and thought that maybe his cat was smarter and wiser than he was, which I think is an interesting possibility. But so Michel de Montaigne was a Renaissance humanist, a French Renaissance humanist. He was a noble who lived in Western France, and after working as a judge for about 10 years, he realized he had enough money just to live on his estate. So he quit his job and just spent his time gardening, riding horses, and writing essays. He invented the word essay.
Oh.
So you have him to thank for everything that you hated about English class. Essay in French literally means an attempt. So instead of writing a whole book or a definitive take on something, he just wrote lots of short essays. He would just be like, what do I think about cats? And then he'd write an essay on cats. He was also very interested in ancient Greek philosophy, and he was especially interested in the ancient Greek school known as skepticism, which said that all knowledge is basically an illusion. We don't actually know anything. Among other things, he also is credited with coining the whole concept of cultural relativism. And he outlines this in one of his essays, which is titled On Cannibals. And the twist here is that you think he's going to be talking about cannibals in the New World, but it turns out that the real cannibals is us.
Are we not in the real world?
Good question.
We're actually living in a simulation.
Well, so Michel de Montaigne would probably not disagree with you, Liam. Or he would at least say, we have no way of knowing whether or not this reality that we live in is, quote unquote, base reality, as Elon Musk would call it. Base reality. Is it really real, or is it just pretend real? But so anyway, I guess we'll just stop there for today.
We're in Earth.
Yeah, that's Michel de Montaigne.
I said we're in
And we'll talk about him and the other guys more on Friday. Bye.